Hello everyone, hope you're having a great weekend. And as you can tell by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about abortion. It's a subject that's been in the news a few times the past couple of weeks. As most of you have probably heard by this point, President Barack Obama, 2 weeks ago Friday, signed an executive order to allow our tax dollars to be used to fund abortions overseas. What this executive order actually did was it overturned a ban put in place by President Bush prohibiting Congress from using our tax dollars in that way to fund abortions overseas. And the other abortion-related issue that's been in the news recently is, of course, the Superbowl ad that was rejected by NBC. And that was produced by a pro-life Catholic organization based in Chicago that they had raised funds from supporters to produce this commercial. They were originally told by NBC that they could air the commercial and then were later rejected. And instead of me characterizing the content of the ad, it's available on YouTube. I have a link to it in my description. I want everyone who hasn't already seen it to click on the link, view it for yourself, and decide whether you think it would have been appropriate to play during the Super Bowl. I, of course, think it would have been entirely appropriate, and I think it was done in good taste. The purpose of the ad was just to provoke thought about the question of abortion and the subject of abortion, just to make people think about it. And I don't see how that could ever be a bad thing. So with abortion being in the news and it being the hot button issue that it is, I thought I would make a couple of videos and give you my opinion on the subject and also ask for your opinion. So to start with, this executive order signed by Barack Obama, Gallup did a poll and found that 58% of Americans disapproved of Obama's decision to use our tax dollars to fund abortions overseas, and 35% approved of this executive order. So I'm curious what those of you watching this video have to say about this, especially those of you who may have voted for Barack Obama. Is this something that you approve of? Is this the sort of change that you were anticipating? Of course, change was the slogan Barack Obama ran on. He put forward this view of himself that he was a reformer who was going to bring positive change to the White House. But he was never really specific about exactly what sort of change he would bring. Although most of us who really follow politics closely pretty much knew what he meant by change, because you can look back to his record in the Illinois State Senate and also as a U.S. Senator and see exactly where his politics lie and what sort of positions he's actually promoted. And while Barack Obama's political career has been relatively short, he's still been in politics long enough to have established a very clear record on a lot of issues, especially abortion. He's consistently been on the very far left of abortion politics, going back to his time in the state Senate. For those of you who haven't researched it or really, haven't paid that close of attention, I'll go ahead and fill in some of the gaps about this. If you do some digging into Barack Obama's contributions to the abortion issue in Illinois, the first thing you're going to stumble across is something called the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. And to give you some background on this, it's really a bill that was being put forward in a lot of states and also at the federal level in the early 2000s. And it essentially states that any baby that has been born alive is to be legally considered a person, and as such would be granted full protection under the U.S. Constitution. And I mean, it's a very rational and logical position to take, that a baby who is born fully outside of the womb should be considered a person, have constitutional rights, and should be protected. This would seem not to be that controversial of an issue. But surprisingly, there were people who stood against it. And when this bill came forward 3 times in the Illinois State Senate, Barack Obama was always the most vocal and standing against it. And for some background, in 2002, a bill by the same name passed unanimously in the United States Senate. Democrats, Republicans, everybody agreed and voted in favor of this bill. A bill with the exact same language came before Barack Obama's committee in 2003, a year later, and he voted against it. He blocked it. I'm sure some of you are wondering why in the world legislation like this would ever be needed, because wouldn't we just assume children who are born have full rights as people under the U.S. Constitution? Well, it happened that, especially in Illinois, this sort of legislation was needed because it had come out in the news that at certain hospitals in Chicago, children were being born alive as a result of a botched abortion and then being left to die in utility rooms in the hospital. And this was actually happening between 11 to 30 times a year, which is a lot for children who are alive, born alive, to be left to die from neglect because it was supposed to have been an abortion. So this sort of legislation was put forward to address something that was actually taking place, a problem that the state actually had, and that was that children born alive who were intended to have been aborted, but because of a botched abortion, these children were born alive, that they were just being put in a utility room to die because the mother had intended for them to be aborted. Now, many of these situations involved abortions that were being attempted in the second trimester, and the babies who were born as a result of the botched abortion were considered pre-viable, meaning that they had not developed to the point that they could really exist on their own outside of the womb long term. They had fully functioning hearts, they were thinking, they had muscular movement, the children could breathe, but the issue is usually their lungs had not developed to the point that they could really survive for more than 8 or 9 hours on their own outside of the womb. But some small percentage of these children likely were viable. And that's really why some sort of legislation had to be put in place to address this situation. Not only to prevent any of these children from just being treated as garbage and put off in a room on their own to die from neglect, but to protect those who could survive and were outside of the womb. And I think Barack Obama made his most revealing statement, not when he was standing against the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, but when he was standing against a corollary bill in the Illinois State Senate called Senate Bill B-1663. Now, this was a companion bill which would have required, in this situation where a child is born as a result of a botched abortion, that a physician be brought in and assess the viability of the child. And he vocally stood against this. And I'm going to go ahead and play the audio from his testimony before the Senate.
Essentially adding an additional doctor who then has to be called in an emergency situation to come in and make these assessments is really designed simply to burden the original decision of the woman and the physician to induce labor and perform an abortion.
So what Barack Obama was saying here is that he doesn't want a bill passed that's going to require a physician to come in and assess whether this child can live on its own, because to do so would defeat the purpose of the mother coming there to begin with. The mother came there to abort the child, so bringing in a physician to determine if the child can survive and then giving it medical care or whatever in order to allow it to survive, that would be a bad thing, because that would defeat the purpose of the mother coming there to begin with. And I think that is a very extreme view on abortion. Basically, what we have here is someone advocating a post-birth abortion. That if the mother intends to abort the child and the child lives, that we should not do anything to help that child or assess whether it can live on its own. Any sort of bill like that, Barack Obama considered to be a negative thing. In fact, Illinois was unable to pass any form of the Born Alive Infants Protection Act until after Barack Obama left the state Senate and came to the United States Senate. Then in 2005, they were finally able to pass this bill that they had worked to pass for so long, and that became law in Illinois. So, given this history and Barack Obama's position on this subject, which, I mean, this is basically the very extreme where you find very few people, very few people who would disagree with the text of the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. And keep in mind, it passed unanimously in the United States Senate. This is where we can really see Barack Obama's commitment to the pro-choice, pro-abortion movement.